Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Maybe it's middle of the night, wherever you are. My name is Michael Hebb, and I'm here with my good friend, Deanna Cochran. How are you, Deanna?
Hello, I'm Deanna, and I'm founder of Care Doula School of Accompanying the Dying. Doing well. I'm so happy to be here with you and Dr. Candi Cann.
So we and Deanna is being very humble. She's one of the pioneers in the death doula space and has a hospice RN and many things. Has been doing remarkable things in this end of life space for a long time. And we are here for a special kind of spooky season edition. We have a lot of holidays coming up that deal with the dead. Obviously, Halloween and Day of the Dead, the lesser known All Saints Day, and many others. And there's no one that I can think of that's better to chat about it than my dear friend, Dr. Candi Cann. How are you, Candi?
I'm good. It's so great to be here with both of you guys.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, Candi, I'll give you a little just brief introduction. People are going to learn more about your work as we go, but Dr. Candi Cann is a professor at Baylor, where she does teach about death and dying and rituals and grief, and is also a renowned author of many books. I'll name a couple. Dying to Eat, one that's near and dear to my heart, about the different perspectives when it comes to food and grief and death and dying. And also Virtual Afterlives, a real look at technology and death and dying, grief. But let's kick it off maybe with before we get into the specifics of these holidays, how did you end up doing work in the end of life space and in the grief space?
That's a great question. So for me, it started with a death and dying in Buddhist cultures course that I took when I was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And every week in the summer, we would spend our entire Saturday at a different Buddhist temple around the island of Oahu. And during that time, we would spend about 8 hours at the temple. We would eat a vegetarian Buddhist meal. We would listen to funeral chanting from that particular Buddhist tradition. So we did Tibetan Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, etc. And we would read a particular book about the major scriptures and prayers concerning the dead in that particular Buddhist sect. And I was hooked after that. I just loved studying this. And I remember going home and talking to my mom, who happened to also be doing her degree as an adult. She went back to school in counseling, and she was taking a death and dying course. And so we had lots of really great, interesting, long conversations. And I remember doing my paper on the food traditions at the Chinese Buddhist cemetery. And so I would drive by the cemetery every day, and there would be like Big Macs and shakes and all this stuff on the graves. And so I was fascinated. I wanted to know what this was about. And so I did my paper on that. And after that, I just loved anything in death and dying.
Amazing. And you went to Harvard for your PhD and then went on to University of Hawaii. What did you study at Harvard? Just curious, like were you studying religion, death and dying?
So at Harvard, I got a PhD in comparative religions, looking at basically studying martyrological narratives in Latin America and in Asia. So I ended up narrowing that down and looking at, I basically studied two martyrs, and one that was about to be canonized by the Catholic Church and one that hadn't been canonized yet. And then I went to Argentina, to Buenos Aires. I went to Shanghai and China, and I interviewed the families and friends of these popular martyrs to find out more about how martyrs are made and how what I found is that martyrs are completely manufactured, and families and friends really kind of help create martyrs. And so that was kind of looking at death and dying in text and the way it operates through the church. the way people are recognized through death as faithful adherents of a particular religious sect. So that was super fascinating. And one of my martyrs, the one I thought was about to be canonized, ended up not being canonized at all because the Catholic Church in China has completely shifted its politics. And then the guy that I was researching in Argentina that was not popular at all has now had several documentaries, lots of rock music has been made in his honor, and he's now like super famous and has blown up. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to me. So that's what I did for my PhD.
Well, yeah, Deanna, jump in there because you
What
were.
a wonderful way to spend your 20s. My God. I'm right there with you. I just can't think of a better way to spend my life than to study what you were studying. Well, I kind of am on a different angle, but I have to ask, who was it? Who's the one? Who's the one from South?
The one who blew up in Argentina, his name is
Yeah.
Carlos Mujica. And today he's considered the first martyr of the Dirty War, which is the era of the military dictatorship in Argentina. And so he was actually killed 2 years before the Dirty War started officially. But today he's absolutely beloved and revered. And I think he will end up being canonized by the church. I met his sister. I met with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, the Abuelas. I met all of the big players and key figures in the villas in which he worked. And I even have a piece of his blood up in my bedroom upstairs because his sister cut up his pants after he had been shot 9 times and then distributed it to people that she felt would help canonize him. So that was kind of interesting.
What was it? What was it that made him have that interest that canonize him? What was it? I don't know. What was it that made him loved like that?
Oh, he was a huge champion for the poor. So he came from this really wealthy family. He was just super handsome, blonde martyr. He was a priest, and he was came from this very wealthy family, super handsome guy, but he decided to devote his life to the church. And so he was actually kind of friend adjacent to the liberation theologians that were working at that time in Latin America. And he was trying to really advocate for the poor. And he was the perfect priest to do so because he came from this upper class segment of society in Buenos Aires. So he was able to kind of speak to them on behalf of the poor. Yeah, he was amazing. And he was shot though, because he had a popular radio program that he was always on, and he was shot leaving the church one night after he had done engagement counseling for couples, and he was shot 9 times. So they really wanted him dead. I mean, he wasn't just accidentally shot. They went after him. So he really is considered the first martyr of the Dirty War in Argentina, and a true advocate for the poor. He had a real heart for the poor. Yeah, so I really admire him. I loved getting to study him, and I loved getting to visit the beach. I lived in Buenos Aires for 5 years, and my family lived in the kind of wealthy neighborhood. We all worked in the embassy of the United States, and it surprised me how much I have missed living there. So going back and really researching his life and visiting the villas, it really opened my eyes to a whole other world of Latin America.
Oh,
Phenomenal. So people that are just joining us, we were talking about Candi's early work with martyrs, which we should do a whole segment on because obviously.
I've never really talked about it in like years.
Yeah. Well, and I've got a multi-tiered question before we get into talking about Halloween and Day of the Dead, and that is, so you get martyred, and then maybe you'll become a saint. Is part one of the question. I imagine martyr is like you've got to get through that status to get up to sainthood potentially, and then is Gwen Shamblin going to be martyred and sainted?
Is who going to be martyred?
I just started watching the HBO documentary on Gwen Shamblin. I don't know if you know about this.
I haven't watched it yet. I just finished a Squid Game, so that's where I'm at.
Christian leader who died in a plane crash, who was famous for the Way Down methodology. Anyway, back to the martyr. That was just more of a funny aside.
So actually, if you're martyred, you can technically be fast tracked for sainthood. So it is one of the ways. You're supposed to have a couple of verifiable miracles at the church. And I mean, the Catholic Church is like so into research. So I really love like reading all their documents and stuff. But if they feel that there is a possible miracle that qualifies a martyr for sainthood, then they go and they conduct a ton of research on it, like years of research. And the documents they have on this stuff is amazing. Just amazing archives. And so you actually are supposed to have 2 verifiable miracles. So martyrdom can kind of fast track you to sainthood, which is why I do think Mujica will become a saint at some point. Plus, the Catholic Church needs more global South saints. They need more people from the global South. They have a lot of European saints, and we don't need more of those. We need more global South saints. So, and I do think with Pope Francis being in office, that hopefully more attention's being paid to the canonization process for those martyrs in Latin America.
Love it.
Wow.
Well,
I don't
Deanna,
even know what squid is. I'm now, because she plays squid, I got to look at squid because I'm your new biggest fan.
It's the Netflix #1 show on Netflix right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm watching it because all my students are watching it, and I want to be cool.
Absolutely. That's the cool card. Yeah, totally.
And
Totally.
the only reason I haven't watched it is I feel like it's going to stress me out, and I like TV to not stress me out. But nonetheless, let's talk to us about Halloween, Day of the Dead. What the hell are these things? Why do we put on costumes? What are we doing?
All right, so this is one of my favorite topics. So the American Halloween tradition probably comes from the All Souls Day parades in England. And during those parades, you would have people beg for food, and families would often give them pastries that were known as soul cakes in return for their promise to pray for the dead and the family's dead relatives. Now, I think we talked about this before we started, but one of the things I love about this is that often festivals and even funerals are used as a way to answer a community's food insecurity issues. So we definitely see this with these parades that happen, right? Because it kind of stems back to the Middle Ages when you had the practice of corpse cakes, where you would have a person who would die, but you weren't sure they had gone to heaven. So you would place a cake on their corpse, and what would happen would be the cake would supposedly absorb all the sins of the corpse, and then you would pay someone who was poor to eat the cake, and then you would also give them some money. So this was a way in which you kind of had this transactional solution for food insecurity, but at the same time, the wealthy families then became reassured that their dead loved ones now were absolved of sin and would hopefully then maybe not spend so much time in purgatory and reach heaven. So there's an interesting tie here between the corpse cakes and the soul cakes that you then distribute in these festivals. So this is what's believed to be the history of the practice of distributing candy. And it was called going souling. And children would then eventually take up this practice and go around the neighborhood and collect the cakes, which then morphed into the candy. Now, in one of my books, I talk about like the history of the candy. So we see sugar being utilized around the world. So in China, for example, when you attend a funeral, a little brown sugar candy is distributed at the end of the funeral, because it's believed that if you go home sad, that ghosts could follow you home and cause bad fortune to fall in your house. So by eating sweet candy as you leave with these kind of sweet feelings and a sweet taste in your mouth. And that causes you then to dispel this kind of negative emotion that might be associated with grief or sadness. So we do see candy being used a lot. I also think there's a biochemical element to the notion of candy, right? I mean, sugar gives us a high. Everyone knows that high that they get. So I do think there's kind of this rush of endorphins and serotonin and all this stuff that you get from the sugar itself. So I think that's partly where we get the turn towards candy. But I would also say, and then I'll stop and let you guys jump in, that in the United States especially, there's a real shift from remembering the dead through Halloween to forgetting the dead by going trick-or-treating and focusing on children. So Alan Dundes, he's a really famous folklorist. He talks about the future orientation of Halloween practices in the United States and how here we really focus on children. So the Halloween holiday is no longer the dead, the old, the food insecure, the poor. Now is completely about the future. So he says it's now a very future-oriented holiday. We really center on children and kind of focus on children. And I think that's a really important aspect because I think Halloween is really shifted. And this is why I think Dia de los Muertos has grown in popularity, because there's this kind of underlying resistance to just focusing on the future as a part of this holiday.
You even think within Mexico or within the States, as they're trying to find meaning in anything. And here we are so culturalist, it seems. So do you think it's the United States people that are trying to find meaning and focusing on Dia de los Muertos, or do you think the Mexicans themselves are doing it?
So that's a good question. What I would say is there could be two things going on at the same time. People could be looking for meaning and therefore turning towards Dia de los Muertos. But we're also seeing this growing Hispanic population here in the US, right? So it's going to be 30% of the United States will be Latinx. And I think there's also just this growing awareness of what it means to be Latinx. And now people are not hiding their identity and they're embracing it. So I think there's this kind of resurgence, if you will, of traditional culture. So I think it could be both.
And also the commercial. I think commercialized too, because it's a way to make money. People are coming up with beautiful things, and I'm not downing that. But I think that it might be a little bit of everything if we're doing the Day of the Dead. I've had people contact me all in this month wanting me to do this and that and the other. I just don't, I'm Hispanic and I just don't want to do that right now. I understand why people do, but I'm not gonna, just right now, I just don't want to be the spokesperson for the Mexicans around dying. It just doesn't appeal to me, because just even reading, if people were to read about how we in the Hispanic community, Latino and Latinx community, even talk about ourselves, there's no consensus about even how to refer to ourselves by country, by language, by indigenous, like it's just so much. Are we going to do Latino, Latina, Latinx, all of that. So I think Day of the Dead is just woo, party, pretty colors, candy, make an altar. And I think it is bringing though meaning. I do. I think that people might, for whatever reason, get introduced to it, but it does provide a space of meaning. I really do. I agree with you.
It's hard, right? Because you don't want to get on the appropriation bandwagon, but at the same time, it does create meaning, right?
Yeah, and it's beautiful.
Well, let's talk about the history of the Day of the Dead. In my mind, I've always conflated as Halloween, it's coming out of the Day of the Dead, but I love that doesn't make sense because they do seem quite distinct. And I want to put a parenthetical reminder around this idea of forgetting the dead or taking care of the dead. And let's come back to that. And maybe you'll talk about it with Day of the Dead. And I know it's central to your work, but what is the history of the Day of the Dead?
So you have the Spanish who basically invade Mexico, right, in 1519. But the Aztecs at that time are already celebrating a kind of Day of the Dead holiday, but it's in the summer, which I will say it's celebrating Mitecacihuatl, who's the kind of guardian of the underworld. And it's celebrated though in the summer, which I will say is the date that is celebrated in Japan and China. So many countries around the world have some kind of festival surrounding the Day of the Dead, as do the Aztecs. But when the Spanish enter, then there's this kind of fusion of cultures, appropriation of cultures, and a mixture. So this is where you see the images of the lady, the dead, the Mitecasihuatl, this kind of image. And then you also see this desire by the Creoles and the Peninsulares. They're wanting to kind of recreate the experience of their commemoration in the church, although here in Mexico City. And one of the things I love that happens here, so Mexico doesn't have a ton of money at this time, but they're rich in sugar. So basically they take the sugar and they recreate these gorgeous statues that they see in Europe. And so this is partly where you get this, the calaveras and the practice of making these sugar skulls. So you've got the Aztec practice of remembering the dead, that includes placing a skull on the altar with the name written on it to honor their place in the afterworld. And only now those skulls are replaced with these sugar skulls. So, and of course that's become very, very popular. But again, I would also say this idea of using sugar in death is not unique, because I think part of it is this desire to create a material conduit through food between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But also sugar is just this great biochemical, substance that also sweetens one's everyday experience, right? And at this time, it's still relatively rare. I mean, sugar is still considered an expensive spice, if you will. It's still a rarity. Putting sugar on your desserts was really unusual, or in your tea. You had to be fairly well off. So anyway, does that answer your question, Michael?
So there's a generosity there, and which is interesting to me from the All Saints and All Souls practice, which is a bit more earthbound. It's a bit more taking care of our needs here, as opposed to what I see from the Day of the Dead, which probably harkens back more to the Aztec, but it's less transactional. You leave things on the altar. You don't consume things as much. You leave their favorite things. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that, but maybe that's also a distinction between forgetting the dead with a sugar rush and taking care of the dead. Talk to us more about that.
Yeah, so Tony Walter is a sociologist out of the University of Bath, and he's written a lot about this distinction between remembering the dead and caring for the dead. And I really love that distinction because, I feel like Protestants tend to want to remember the dead, but reformulate community without the deceased. Whereas Catholics, more traditional societies, for example, in China, which is where I spent a lot of my field work, you see this really heavy desire to actually care for the dead, to integrate the dead into these practices. So you're truly feeding them. They're revisiting the world, and you're giving them food, you're giving them drink. You are caring for them in their new form in the afterlife. And so in this way, I think it's slightly different than the Protestant practice, where we're trying to kind of leave them behind and formulate a new story without them. And as you mentioned, there is this practice of giving people their favorite foods and their favorite drinks. And also you go to the graveyard and you clean the graveyard and you take care of the graveyard. So this becomes this kind of communal practice where families go together to visit the dead and to care for the dead and to honor them and remember them in the world of the living.
Yeah. Oh, quick question, and I know Deanna's got questions.
Oh, no.
Why? Back to Halloween. Why are we wearing costumes, do you think?
What was your question, Michael?
Back to Halloween. Why do you think we're wearing costumes?
So one of the main reasons is because you're trying to scare the ghosts away. So let me just tell you, so you have All Saints Day, which is on November 1st. Halloween is All Hallows Eve. It's been shortened to Halloween. So this is the night before All Saints Day. Now, All Saints Day is a holiday that celebrates the saints and martyrs, known and unknown. On November 2nd, you have All Souls Day, which is technically the day all the dead come back. But the belief here is that this is a time of the year when there's kind of a communication between the living, the world of the living, and the world of the dead. So there was, and you have to understand that there's a popular belief, right? The culturally popular belief, which may not be the church doctrinal belief, which might be quite different, right? What the church says they believe in and you're supposed to believe in is quite different than what you might actually believe in. And that can be best expressed through this kind of popular belief in ghosts and ghost stories, right? But the idea is that a lot of people believe that the dead might return during this time, and that you should wear costumes so that the dead don't recognize you, don't follow you home, don't do malevolent things to you, don't curse you, don't cause problems for you. So a lot of it has to do with ghosts. And I have a professor of mine from my Harvard days. He studies ghosts in China, but he studies ghosts in urban areas in China. And it's very interesting in his studies of ghosts. He's found that ghosts tend to represent these kind of urban anxieties and contemporary anxieties that we feel. So in other words, whether you believe in ghosts or not is really irrelevant. But the stories around ghosts and the beliefs that pop up around them, the folklore that emerges, reveals a kind of social anxiety that runs throughout our culture and our society. So ghost stories are really important. Whether you believe that they actually exist is kind of irrelevant. They still reveal so much about what bothers us, what concerns us, what worries us. So one of the things that people worried about was they might somehow also be sent to this world of the dead, right? So by wearing a costume, you are asserting the fact that you are indeed alive. And I also think there's this carnivalesque aspect that you can jump into another identity, and it gives you this chance to be someone who you are not, right? Every year, everyone likes to wear costumes that are completely different from who they are. So there's this really kind of carnivalesque aspect as well. But the real meaning behind why did people start wearing costumes was to get rid of the ghosts. So the ghost would not recognize them and follow them home and haunt them forever.
Now, these are the same ghosts that you're calling in through altars and stuff and the Day of the Dead. And you're still, are you protecting yourself from your own family you're calling in, or from the next door neighbor's family?
I think it could be anybody, but yeah, I mean, there's a way in which you're holding boundaries, right?
Holding boundaries through the costume.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, you were talking too, I was thinking, and you brought up the Carnivalesque, and I like that. I'm just thinking how it started, this meaning and ghosts and all this. And then now it's this super sexualized, everybody's so hot at Halloween, right? At the adult parties. And then the children were dressing them in all kinds of interesting cultural ways that people are now getting angry about, right? So it's like, wow, it's confusing now. To me, it's confusing. I liked when, Michael, when you started this, hey, what's up with Halloween? Because today it is not simple, right? What do you think's going on like today, Candi?
Gosh, that's a complicated question. And, we both live in Texas, right? Where you also have this like Bible Belt aspect that confuses it even more. And you have certain churches that will say, oh, well, you shouldn't celebrate Halloween because of its Celtic origins and blah, blah, blah. But then they'll hold a trunk or treat in their church parking lot on the Saturday before. So, I mean, how is that different? I mean, just because you get to regulate the costumes, like no devils. I mean, my daughter's private school used to be like, no devils. Okay, you can be angels, but not devils. Like, yeah, I don't know. I really do think it's this carnivalesque aspect that people get a chance to be someone they're not. And it's condoned, right? You're socially allowed to be someone that normally you would not be allowed to be. And so there's this chance to step outside of yourself and to be in the margins and to be in this liminal state, which gives you a sense of freedom. And it gives you this chance to act in ways you wouldn't normally be allowed to act. So I think there's some really interesting aspects of Halloween, but it is confusing. I agree. And the whole like,
It's clear. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go.
No, it's clear as you're talking. What's so clear as you're talking is that death is opening a door to our boundaries. I love it. I love it. That could be just simplify it right there in a way, because it is. It's all over the place. But as you're talking, doing whatever we're doing, Halloween, whatever it means about dying and death for us, we're getting into costume. We're going and we're actually giving thought to ourselves, and we are pushing boundaries. Absolutely. Getting into different things that we don't get to or allow ourselves to. And that's what the invitation around death is about, is living a full life.
Well, and that's the part no one talks about, right? Because people get offended if you say it, but it's like, okay, now your parents have died. You have no family. It sucks. But now you can be whoever you want to be. You're not constrained by your parents' expectations of who you were supposed to be. There's a real freedom there. But no one ever talks about that. I mean, we're just not allowed to talk about that, right?
Well, in a society that has another massive epidemic of meaning, if you don't know your purpose for being here, and then you have that freedom doesn't feel like freedom.
That's
and so there's a lot of existential, difficulty that can come with that, I'm sure. And I mean, that's not the only reason why you shouldn't feel freedom from, your parents dying. I'm not saying that. I just think it is we're talking about a layer cake of many things, but I do like this idea of ghosts being a personification of our anxieties. And then you look at the over sexualization, or the sexualization, maybe it's not over, of Halloween. We have a lot of sexual anxiety that's right at the surface in our culture right now, as it should be. But let's talk about ghosts internationally. So you've been talking about Japan, China. Like, let's get more into, like, what are these other ceremonies, even if they're summer ceremonies, that deal with the dead and with ghosts?
So Halloween is cool, but I was thinking about this when you wrote me about this talk. So I feel like there's ghost festivals or death festivals, and then there's harvest festivals, and some of them coincide and some of them do not, right? But they're all around the same time, in that they're all from like August to October. And it makes me think about, the function of a harvest festival. You're coming together to celebrate the harvest, but there's also this underlying anxiety of, will we be able to grow this much food next year? Will we be able to come together as a community? Will we have enough to eat throughout this winter while we all kind of hunker down, right? So there are a lot of fall festivals that also incorporate death. So I was thinking about Chuseok, for example, in Korea. It operates kind of like a ghost festival / Thanksgiving. It's like the Korean Thanksgiving, but you actually go out to the gravesite, you pour wine, you make offerings to the dead at the site of the grave. In China, the Ghost Festival is the 15th of the 7th month, which this coming year will be August 12th, I believe. No, August 12th. And there it's a ghost festival, and you eat certain foods, and again, it's that belief that this realm opens between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And so you make offerings to the ancestors, but part of the reason you make offerings is because you're kind of also bribing them. You want them to take care of you in the next year. You don't want them to do bad things. So you give them money to use in heaven. You give them clothes. You give them all kinds of, now you can buy like paper iPads and paper cell phones and all kinds of cool stuff. And you eat usually glutinous rice. And the idea there is that it kind of keeps their mouth stuck together so they can't say anything bad about you when they go back and give a report on you. In Japan, you have the Obon season, which I'm originally from Hawaii, and we celebrate Obon for a whole month in Hawaii. So it's also the 15th of the 7th lunar calendar month, which next year it will be celebrated again mid-August. And there it's the same kind of thing. You make like a bunch of mochi, you make certain foods, you do special dances. And it's a Buddhist celebration in Japan, but it has kind of ties also um, to the Taoist celebrations that you see in China. And then in Hawaii, we stretch it out from one weekend to an entire month. And basically it becomes this way in which these temples in Hawaii assert their Japanese identity, while also remembering and honoring the dead. So people will go from like temple to temple to temple and do all the dances, and you eat all the foods. And in Hawaii, they like print out a whole month of dances for the dead in a special program. And each temple is really well known for a particular temple food during this time, during Obon season. And so you'll plan like where you're going based on what foods you want to have. But again, a lot of them are known for mochi, and you get little souvenir towels, and you collect these towels every time. So there's lots of different celebrations for the dead around the world. And I think Diwali is coming up. That's not really a celebration for the dead, but it is a festival of lights. And the idea is that you've overcome this darkness, and so you send little lanterns floating down the stream with candles on them to show that the light overcomes the darkness. So there's this element there of death in the background, and overcoming adversity. So there's so many different festivals around the world that I think are just beautiful.
Yeah. Well, with Diwali, I mean, when is the other time you put something that is burning or has burnt into the river in India? And
Yeah.
that's when they die. So I mean, I don't think it's a big stretch there to see that as a lighter version of putting a loved one's body into the Ganga.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, I was had the sunrise canoe ride, or boat ride, in Varanasi, when I was there, and
Oh, wow.
and to watch the the cremations on the steps, and people swimming, and bringing ashes. I mean, there's no question about the power and the connection to that river. It's considered like the connection to the afterlife and to the other world is that river. So
Right.
pretty remarkable. Do you have something question burning, Deanna?
No, I'm just really enjoying the reverence that we humans have for meaning, you know, and connection with the people we love. And we reach and stretch in ways that's, when we hear the story, like the stories you're sharing, I resonate. And I've never been in that culture. I might have never been in that country. I don't know what celebration you're talking about. If I would have had a year to study your website, maybe I would. I just find it so resonant. It's just beautiful. I'm kind of reveling in this right now. But you were talking about food, that you have a whole thing of food.
Yeah, you wrote an incredible book about food. Right before we get to that, because I want to get to that, say a little bit more, because this is some of the work that we did together in the COVID paper. Really opened my eyes to the opportunity for healing, and using the taking care of the dead model, which is so ancient, as a way of healing, or reorienting ourselves with our grief, that I think can be maybe more helpful than the remembering, or, as I was incorrectly saying earlier, which I kind of stand by, forgetting the dead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one of the things we talked about with the COVID paper was one of the models for grief, and that has only recently really taken off in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, has been continuing bonds theory. And that's where someone who's grieving a deceased loved one figures out a way to kind of continue in a new relationship with the dead, and it's encouraged and it's seen as healthy. Um, and I gave a lecture a couple of years ago about continuing bonds theory, and this lady came up to me. She said, "If I had only heard you 10 years ago, you would have saved me so much therapy," because she thought there was something wrong with her because she wanted to continue this relationship with the dead. And so I've kind of become quite passionate about this grief model. Dennis Class, he went to Japan, he lived in Japan, he saw these beautiful ways of interacting with the dead and integrating the dead into our lives. So then he came back and he worked with Silverman and some other grief theorists and developed this continuing bonds theory. And so it really does acknowledge this need that we humans have to learn how to live with the dead in their new state, as opposed to, as you said, Michael, forgetting the dead. I mean, I think so many people are just encouraged to move on, to get over it, which I just think is, how do you do that? I mean, it's like chopping off a limb. Like, we don't do that. We learn how to live with this loss, but part of learning how to live with the loss is learning how to reintegrate the deceased into our lives in their new state. So yeah, I could talk forever about that.
Yeah. Well, there's the disconnection of when you talk to people about their grief or their loss, and then you can see the clear that you look weird if you even suggest that they can still continue a relationship with their dead loved one, and you would, it's insulting to keep going that way. They're too freaked out. Some people are like that, so to companion somebody who feels like that, it's not comforting, but there's so many people where it is comforting. I mean, that they've never heard, like this woman who went to you, they've never even heard they could like allowed to do that, never knew.
And I think that goes to your earlier comment, Deanna, about Dia de los Muertos. Maybe that's partly why it's resonating so much with people, because Dia does say it's okay. It's okay to continue these relationships with these people. And it's not only okay, it's beautiful. And here's one way to do it. I feel like if we could give people more tools and more permission to really embrace our relationships with the deceased, and to continue to have bonds with them. I mean, my mom, she still visits me. Every time something's going wrong, she visits me. She hangs out with me in my dream. Like, and I always feel so comforted by it, and it's only like every 5 or 6 years, only when something's really wrong. But my mom or my brother, or my grandma, someone will show up and just kind of hang out with me. And I know I'm not alone. And I remember how much they love me. And I think that's what's so comforting about continuing bonds theory. So yeah, I think maybe that's partly why Dia has become such a popular kind of way of thinking about the dead and honoring the dead.
Absolutely. And listeners that are live with us, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A tab if you have questions for Candi. The kind of irony, and irony is the wrong word because it's a little bit more sad than that, but the fact being that every wisdom tradition that I know of is based upon getting information from the dead or the immaterial, from spirit, right? And so that we don't give people permission to turn to their own personal ancestors and have an ongoing relationship. Of course, there's less information about why we're here, what we're doing with this life, what our destiny is. And you and I have talked about much and sparked some controversy around the stage-based theory, or the 5 stages of grief, which I'd love for you to speak about if you're willing. But in basis, it's this linear model of saying, get through these and you're done. Thank you very much. On to the next. And that's not how grief works.
Yeah. So yes, we did cause controversy, didn't we? So one of the problems is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 52, 53 years ago, was amazing in fostering this conversation on death. But when she wrote her phenomenal book about grief, she was writing about grief while dying, not grief after someone has died. And so this has been misapplied. So a lot of people who are grieving think they're supposed to work through these stages, and that if they're not following the stages, there's something wrong with them. Well, that's not how grief works. It's usually a polarity of one thing or another, and you're going back and forth, a kind of oscillation of well-being to not so well-being, and continuing that oscillation. And so Americans also love stages. We love goals, we love stages, and we love knowing that we're making progress. So I think it's one of the appeals of stage-based grief theory. However, I don't think that's the way grief works. And so I really do think continuing bonds theory has given us a great way to kind of challenge that stage-based theory. But it also gives us validation that perhaps our non-stage-based models that we are not necessarily following or feeling is okay, and that the kind of grief that we are experiencing is okay. And so yeah, and I loved is it Anne Lamott? She talks about how for her, grief was, it feels like she broke her leg and her leg never quite healed, but she learned how to dance with the broken leg afterwards. And that's really what grief is. It is something you learn to move forward through life carrying. It doesn't necessarily get resolved or get moved through stages. Yeah. Oh, Michael, you're going to answer this question live.
Well, I'm not going to. You're going to.
You're going to. Yeah.
Question from Bob Hoffman, who is our best question asker of all sessions. Can Dr. Cann share more about the pragmatics of virtual afterlives and how we can develop space for our own virtual afterlife? And then let's talk about food, because sorry, we took a right-hand turn, Deanna.
Oh, no, keep going. We're going good.
So my book, Virtual Afterlives, really traced the way that we're moving from popular memorialization customs, so like roadside memorials, and how that shifted to memorials that we kind of carry with us. So t-shirt memorials, tattoo memorials. Tattoo memorials have become one of the most popular ways for people to memorialize today. And then on to virtual memorials, so social media memorials, the ways that people memorialize online. And I would say now we've even progressed past this. And Michael really is the person who should answer this question because he's so plugged into the tech world and the death tech world. It's amazing. But now there's some really cool stuff going on with virtual reality where you can meet your loved one through virtual reality. There are games where people have created entire games around their deceased loved ones. There's a lot of virtual stuff going on. There is also, the whole transhumanism movement. I have yet to figure out how I feel about it, but you can create a digital bot online. You can interact with your digital bot, and then eventually you can, so that's called a mind file, and there are companies that will then take it for a small amount of money that will take your DNA file or your bio file and connect that at some point down the road with your mind file. So they're hoping to extend lives, perhaps create new lives, transhumanist lives. So there's a lot going on. For me, the purpose of virtual afterlives was to validate those people who are using new social media tools because they have no other place to grieve in mainstream areas. And that's really what I want to give a voice to those people who feel they can't talk about death, who can't express their grief, because they might work, for example, in an hourly job where they're not given the time off to really grieve and to help with their parents' estate, or to grieve their friend because they're not recognized as a valid family member. So for me, virtual afterlives was challenging that kind of everyday norm of who gets to be family, who gets to determine why we grieve. and then how we choose to memorialize. And I really want to validate people who are memorializing in these unusual spaces or virtual spaces, because they have no in-person or real life place to grieve.
That's right. That's right. I mean, because it's not always that the person that's closer to the person that dies that gets to take possession of that body and possession of the memorialization. So it does give some great license. So we have another question coming in from Steph that I think is a great question. My question is about cultural appropriation. I'm interested in creating an experience for a community in the coming weeks that calls us into awareness and conversation around this topic of honoring and remembering the dead. I'm concerned about drawing too much from other worldly or other cultural traditions as a white woman and disrespecting the people and lineages they come from, while also feeling inspired by how global cultures relate to their dead in ways that we don't have our own cultural context for. What should
That's
Steph
a great
do?
question. Deanna, do you have an answer for that?
You know, I'm reading a lot right now. Well, not reading, I'm going to the social circles. I'm going to TikTok, I'm going to Facebooks and Instagrams, and I'm just YouTube videos, and I'm watching I'm trying to just see what are people feeling. I can't go by just my feeling. I'm Hispanic, I'm English, Irish. My mom was, and my dad's fully Hispanic. So I feel like I've always been a half breed, and I've always been able to do anything because I'm this and I'm that. And I've talked to so many people who are mixed and who are wholly this and wholly that. And there's no consensus is what my question, my thing is. There's no, some people feel we're proud. We want you to know of our culture. We want you to integrate and assimilate what we are. That's what we would love that. And there are other people saying, no, that's rude and disrespectful. So I'm really taking all this in right now, very aware of respecting people's culture. And I think it's a matter of this. There are certain things the lay people can do. Like when you go learn any kind of tool, say, and it's some kind of medicine, ancient medicine tool, or say, and the teacher will always tell you, you can do this, but you have to be trained to do that. And so I kind of think if we can go about it by what can I do? And what do I need to leave alone as something for just you, your elders, and your community? But it's right now, what I'm hearing is mixed. Nobody's saying the same thing. What would you say? Like, I don't know how to answer that, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I agree. I'm a third culture kid. So I grew up in Thailand and then lived in Hawaii. So for me, and then I moved to the mainland for my job. And so I agree. It's really weird for me though, because, I'm a Caucasian Irish girl, but I didn't grow up in a Caucasian Irish American culture at all. So I don't know either. I mean, it's, for me, home is Asia in many ways, or Asian Pacific culture, because that's where I lived most of my life. So, yeah, I don't have any better answer either. And even my language has shifted over the years. When I first started writing about Hispanic Catholic culture, that switched to Latina culture, which is now switched to Latinx culture. But I teach a course in Argentina and Brazil, and my students hate Latinx, and we always have these great conversations. So, I mean...
It is. I think what I love about it all, though, is it's giving us a chance to really go into our internal values and to, and then have also respect for each other who don't want to. I don't care about Latinx. I'm 60 years old, though. Latina, I grew up with that. Latinx, I can't even say it. If somebody wants to say that, that's fine with me. I'll honor it. But there are things that aren't important to certain of us and things that are. But what I love about all of that's happening is we're gaining more respect and more awareness. And to me, if we just can look at that and not where we screw up about it, but that, hey, they have a heart to want to, and can we give them a break? They didn't say the right thing, or, might not understand the new growth and areas of consciousness that I love that is happening. We just have to give each other a break. And so this question here, what I love about it is she's saying, hey, I want to respect, and I also want to broadcast the beauty of it all. So to me, if you can present it, facilitate it like that, here's here, here, without acting like you're expert at any of it, right? Could it be that simple as to share?
Well, I'll add a couple things as a cisgendered white man who is, hopefully living in a not cisgendered white world more and more every day. And everywhere I turn, there's great lessons and learnings that I get to do and take part of. And I would say that that's I work in so many different traditions and with so many different religions, et cetera, around death. And I'd say the most important thing, Steph, is be teachable. Check your intention. Why is it you want to do this? Now, if you're appropriating something and you're making a profit off it, people are going to get pissed. If you're appropriating and it's about an increase of your power or your presence or how many Instagram followers, yeah, you're definitely going to run into some areas. Now, if it's just because you really want to share something and you want to learn and you want to honor, and that's your intention, and you're willing to be taught. So if somebody in your community says, I have a problem with that, and you're willing to have a conversation with them about it, I've had my ass handed to me so many times publicly. And I think that's an essential thing. But we're coming towards the end here. But Candi, talk to us as we're in the middle of the ghost season. We're in the middle of these traditions, and you've been around so many of these different, and this relates to Steph's questions, but so many different cultures and religions. What have you taken into your personal practice? What are some of the rituals or things that have landed and have a presence in your life, if that's not too personal?
No, that's good. I think for me, I really have a heart for the marginalized and the disenfranchised. So I've started paying attention to the way that these customs answer questions of food insecurity, and I've started really paying attention to the class elements that are embedded in this, because only certain people can even afford a costume, right? If you don't have enough money for your own clothes, how are you going to buy a costume? So there's some real class elements that I think are important to pay attention to, and that I care a lot about. It's a very elite society that can throw candy at strangers and give candy to strangers. I mean, candy's not an essential food, right? So I think in terms of your personal, in terms of what speaks to me personally, I love studying all this stuff. I love thinking about the stories and the many lives behind all of this. So, and I really like the traditional masses for the dead too. So I will be going to church on All Saints Day and All Souls Day. I love these kind of traditional ecclesiastical practices that honor the dead and really name the dead. That's another thing I think that's really important to me, that we name the dead. That I think one of the things with COVID, so many people have died that we've really focused on statistics and numbers, and I want to talk about stories and people.
Yeah, absolutely. Deanna, anything in closing?
I was really conscious of, I'm so glad you said that, Candi, about the, depending on, where you are in the world. I go down to Laredo to take care of my dad, who's towards his end of life. And just going down the street are people with no plumbing there. I mean, I want to write all the time. People are talking about such amazingly stupid stuff when I can walk a mile and they don't even have front doors in this country, so, it's wonderful to think about those of us who can. And I was just so grateful that we are here and we're socially conscious, those of us who are here. And I know that we're thinking of how we can make things better where we are, how we can touch personally. And I just am very grateful. Thank you, Candi, for for saying that. Thank you. That's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking about what am I going to do if I'm in Laredo for Halloween time. I might be. I think I'm going to be, and what we can do. And I'm thank you for that. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful invitation. And Halloween is a very, very important time for me, not because I like to get in a costume. I've only gotten to a costume once since I was 13.
Wow.
That was last year with my daughter and her friends. And the reason I didn't and wasn't able to is because Halloween's the day my dad died. And it just, could not take part in what was Halloween for so many years. And then I actively, in the last couple of years, and I think that I've talked to both of you about this, invited my father, who's always been so present, to go into the ether, into the heavens, into wherever he wants to go, because I've been holding on to him so tight since I was 13. And it released me from that, and I was able to put on a costume and have a great time with my daughter and her friends.
That's beautiful.
Wow. Thank you, Michael.
I don't know what the science says, but I think the ancestors and the ghosts and all of them are here listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're whooping it up. If we want to go there, we can.
That's right.
Totally. Continuing to build relationships. Doesn't matter what plane they're on.
That's
Or
right.
we might be in parallel universes. How do we know? We're so limited. We're so limited.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Candi Cann, thank you, my friend. It's great to see your face and hear your brilliance.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. This was so fun. What an honor.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Have a beautiful spooky season.